Ecce Homo is unlike anything else in philosophy. It is not a treatise, not a systematic argument, not a memoir in the ordinary sense. It is a self-interpretation, Nietzsche explaining who he is, what he has done, and why it matters. And he writes it in 1888, in the final months before his mental collapse. That fact alone has shaped how the book is received. Many readers approach it as a document of madness, a kind of philosophical breakdown on paper. The extravagant titles, the grand claims, the sharp tone, all of it seems to confirm that interpretation. But Nietzsche's intention is the opposite of incoherence. He believes he is writing at the height of clarity. By this point, he has completed what he sees as his major works. Thus, spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals, and Twilight of the Idols have articulated his project, the critique of Western morality and the call for a revaluation of values. What remains is to explain the thinker behind those works. Nietzsche had long feared misunderstanding, not disagreement, but misreading. He expected his ideas to be distorted, trivialized, or absorbed into existing frameworks that neutralize their radical implications. Ecce Homo is an attempt to prevent that. It is Nietzsche saying, "If you want to understand my philosophy, you must understand the conditions that produced it. My health, my temperament, my isolation, my intellectual lineage, even my diet and climate." For him, philosophy is not abstract reasoning detached from life. It is the expression of a particular type of human being. Ideas arise from physiology, psychology, and circumstance. To misinterpret the thinker is to misinterpret the thought. The title itself is telling. Ecce Homo, behold the man, is the phrase spoken by Pontius Pilate when presenting Jesus to the crowd in the gospel narrative. Nietzsche appropriates it deliberately. He is presenting himself not as savior, but as case study. Look at the man. Examine the organism that produced these ideas. Judge whether such a life generates illusion or insight. There is also urgency. Nietzsche senses that his work stands outside his time. He does not expect immediate recognition. In fact, he anticipates hostility and neglect. Writing Ecce Homo is a way of addressing the future rather than the present. He frames himself as a thinker for the day after tomorrow, someone whose ideas will become intelligible only when existing values begin to collapse. The book functions as a message in a bottle, meant to guide readers who will encounter his work under different historical conditions. Importantly, Ecce Homo is not a confession of weakness, it is a defense of strength. Nietzsche refuses to portray himself as victim, martyr, or misunderstood genius crushed by society. Instead, he presents his suffering as productive, his isolation as necessary, and his severity as deliberate. He is not apologizing for his philosophy. He is explaining why it had to take the form it did. This marks a profound departure from traditional autobiography. Most memoirs aim to humanize the author through vulnerability. Nietzsche aims to demonstrate coherence, that his life and thought form a single trajectory. To understand the books, one must understand the man. To understand the man, one must see how his experiences shaped his values. Whether one agrees with him or not, the ambition is unmistakable. Ecce Homo is Nietzsche's attempt to control the narrative of his own intellectual legacy, to ensure that he is read not as a collection of provocative ideas, but as a unified philosophical event. It is philosophy turned inward. Few philosophical works begin with chapter titles like Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, Why I Am a Destiny. To modern readers, the reaction is almost automatic. This sounds like narcissism, grandiosity, even mania. It appears less like philosophy and more like self-worship. Nietzsche knew exactly how it would sound. The tone is deliberate provocation. Throughout his career, he attacked the moral ideal of humility, not modesty as such, but humility as compulsory self-diminishment. In many moral traditions, especially those shaped by Christianity, Overt self-affirmation is treated as suspect. To praise oneself is to display pride. To claim greatness is to violate moral decorum. Nietzsche rejects this framework entirely. If one genuinely believes something to be true, he argues, disguising it in modest language is not virtue but dishonesty. False humility is simply another form of social conformity, a way of making one's excellence palatable. In Ecce Homo, he refuses to perform that ritual. But this does not mean the book is straightforward boasting. Much of Nietzsche's style operates through irony, exaggeration, and reversal. He inflates his claims to expose the conventions that make such speech shocking. The reader is forced to ask, why does this tone feel unacceptable? Why do we expect thinkers to downplay themselves? What moral assumptions govern our reactions? There is also a strategic element. Nietzsche wants to prevent his work from being domesticated. If his ideas are framed politely, they risk being absorbed into the academic mainstream and stripped of their disruptive force. By presenting himself in extreme terms, he resists neutralization. Yet the text is not pure performance. Nietzsche does believe that his work is extraordinary. He sees himself as breaking with 2 millennia of moral philosophy. From that perspective, understated language would feel inadequate. Importantly, his self-affirmation is tied to criteria. He does not claim greatness arbitrarily. He links it to discipline, suffering, independence, and intellectual courage. Whether one accepts those criteria is another matter, but the claims are not empty. Modern readers often interpret this tone psychologically, as compensation for insecurity or evidence of instability. Nietzsche interprets it physiologically. He sees confidence as a sign of strength rather than pathology. A healthy organism does not apologize for functioning well. There is also a deeper philosophical point. Nietzsche rejects the idea of a universal standpoint from which truth can be declared impersonally. Every philosophy expresses a perspective, a type of human being. Acknowledging that perspective openly is, in his view, more honest than pretending to objectivity. When he speaks about himself, he is also speaking about the kind of human required to produce certain ideas. Thus, the apparent narcissism serves multiple purposes: provocation, resistance to moral convention, assertion of philosophical independence, and disclosure of perspective. It is unsettling because it violates expectations. Nietzsche is not trying to appear likable. He is trying to be unmistakable. One of the most unusual features of Ecce Homo is how much attention Nietzsche gives to his body. He discusses migraines, digestive problems, eyesight, climate, diet, sleep, altitude, even the effect of specific cities on his nervous system. For readers accustomed to philosophy as abstract reasoning, this can seem trivial or eccentric. For Nietzsche, it is fundamental. He rejects the traditional view that philosophy is purely intellectual. Ideas do not arise from a disembodied mind. They emerge from a living organism with particular strengths and weaknesses. Physiology shapes perception, temperament, and judgment. Different bodies produce different philosophies. Nietzsche's own health was fragile. He suffered from chronic pain, exhaustion, nausea, and episodes of near blindness. These conditions forced him into an unusually solitary life, with limited social contact and frequent travel in search of tolerable climates. Yet he refuses to interpret illness simply as misfortune. He argues that suffering sharpened his perception. Because he could not rely on stable health, he became acutely attentive to subtle changes in mood, energy, and environment. He learned to discriminate between what nourished him and what depleted him. This sensitivity, he claims, made him a better diagnostician of culture. A person who feels everything intensely cannot ignore contradictions or tensions that others may overlook. What appears normal to the healthy may feel oppressive or artificial to someone whose equilibrium is fragile. Nietzsche therefore presents illness not as heroic martyrdom, but as training in discrimination. He also emphasizes discipline. Managing chronic illness requires constant selection: what to eat, where to live, when to work, when to rest. This necessity cultivates a form of self-mastery that extends beyond physical survival. Health, in his view, is not merely the absence of sickness. It is the ability to integrate weakness into strength, to use limitations as constraints that shape creativity rather than destroy it. This perspective challenges the romantic image of the suffering genius. Nietzsche does not glorify pain for its own sake. He condemns systems that idealize suffering. What matters is whether suffering produces insight or merely resentment. Physiology also grounds his critique of morality. If values emerge from bodily conditions, then moral systems cannot be treated as universal truths. They reflect the needs of particular types of human beings. An ascetic morality may suit those who are weak or exhausted. A life-affirming ethic may suit those with abundant energy. Neither is neutral. By foregrounding his health, Nietzsche is making a philosophical claim. To understand thought, one must consider the organism that produces it. The philosopher is not a pure intellect floating above life. He is a specific configuration of drives, sensitivities, and constraints. In presenting his own body as part of the story, Nietzsche collapses the boundary between biography and philosophy. When Nietzsche asks why he is so wise, he is not referring to accumulated knowledge or academic learning. He is referring to a capacity for selection. Wisdom, in this sense, is not knowing many things. It is knowing what to accept and what to reject, what strengthens and what weakens, what clarifies and what confuses, what nourishes and what exhausts. Nietzsche repeatedly emphasizes that he avoids what harms him. He withdraws from environments, conversations, and influences that drain his vitality. He does not consider this avoidance cowardice. He considers it intelligence. A healthy organism protects itself. He contrasts this with the moral ideal of self-sacrifice, which often demands endurance of harmful conditions as proof of virtue. For Nietzsche, unnecessary self-denial is not noble, it is wasteful. Wisdom is economy. He also links wisdom to sensitivity. A coarse organism can tolerate many things because it feels little. A highly sensitive one must be more selective because stimuli affect it more deeply. What appears as fragility may actually be refined responsiveness. This sensitivity allows him to detect subtle forms of decadence in literature, philosophy, politics, and everyday life. He claims to recognize unhealthy tendencies before they become obvious. Another component of his wisdom is independence from collective opinion. Nietzsche distrusts consensus, especially when it forms quickly. Ideas that are widely accepted often reflect social needs rather than truth. To think clearly, one must sometimes stand outside the group. This does not mean automatic contrarianism. It means evaluating claims without relying on approval as a guide. Wisdom requires the ability to endure isolation without rushing back into conformity. Nietzsche also stresses the importance of timing. Acting too early or too late can be destructive even when the action itself is sound. Wisdom includes knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, when to advance, and when to withdraw. Underlying all of this is a rejection of moralized suffering. Wisdom does not consist in enduring everything. It consists in arranging life so that energy is spent productively rather than squandered. Seen in this light, the chapter title becomes less absurd. Nietzsche is not claiming omniscience. He is describing a disciplined way of living, one that treats vitality as a resource to be protected and directed. Wisdom, for him, is practical rather than theoretical. It is the art of living in a way that maximizes clarity and strength while minimizing unnecessary depletion. If wisdom concerns selection, Nietzsche's idea of being clever concerns strategy. Cleverness, in his account, is not quick wit or intellectual trickery. It is the ability to navigate hostile environments without being destroyed by them, to protect one's project while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Nietzsche spent much of his life isolated from academic institutions, religious communities, and political movements. He lacked the social power that often shields controversial thinkers. Survival required indirect methods. He learned to avoid battles he could not win. Rather than seeking immediate recognition, he wrote for a future audience. Rather than debating critics directly, he often ignored them. Rather than presenting his ideas in conventional formats, he developed an aphoristic style that resisted easy categorization. This was not evasion, it was conservation. Direct confrontation with entrenched systems can consume energy without producing change. Cleverness lies in choosing when engagement is productive and when it is wasteful. Nietzsche also understood the psychological defenses people deploy when their values are threatened. A frontal assault provokes resistance. Indirect approaches can slip past those defenses, allowing ideas to take root gradually. Provocation, irony, and paradox are tools in this strategy. By unsettling readers rather than instructing them, he forces them to participate in interpretation. The discomfort becomes part of the philosophical process. Cleverness also involves self-knowledge. Nietzsche claims to understand his own vulnerabilities, fatigue, illness, overstimulation, and structures his life to minimize their impact. He does not demand that his body conform to an abstract ideal of productivity. He adapts his work to his conditions. This adaptability allows sustained output despite limitations. Another aspect of his cleverness is his refusal to identify with movements. Aligning with a group can provide protection, but it also imposes constraints. One becomes accountable to collective expectations. Nietzsche preferred independence, even at the cost of obscurity. He recognized that ideas tied too closely to a faction risk being reduced to slogans or propaganda. By remaining unattached, he preserved the complexity of his thought. Ultimately, cleverness for Nietzsche is a form of self-preservation in service of creation. It ensures that the thinker survives long enough to complete the work. It is intelligence applied not only to ideas, but to life itself. Nietzsche's claim that he writes such good books is not simply praise for his own ideas, it is praise for his style. He believed that style is not decoration added to thought, it is the embodiment of thought. A philosophical system written in lifeless prose, in his view, reveals something lifeless in the thinking itself. Style expresses physiology. Sharp, concise writing reflects precision of perception. Rhythmic prose reflects internal coherence. Excessive verbosity can indicate confusion or insecurity. For Nietzsche, form and content cannot be separated. He deliberately abandoned the heavy, systematic style typical of German philosophy. Instead, he wrote in aphorisms, fragments, and poetic passages. This allowed him to move quickly between perspectives, to shock the reader out of complacency, and to avoid the illusion that complex problems can be resolved through linear argument alone. The reader must work. Nietzsche wanted his books to function as instruments rather than containers of doctrine. They are designed to provoke interpretation, resistance, and reflection. Agreement is less important than engagement. This is why he often compresses ideas into dense formulations. A single sentence may contain multiple layers of meaning. The apparent simplicity conceals complexity. He also valued musicality. Language for him should have rhythm and energy. Dull prose dulls perception. Vivid language can awaken sensitivity. Another aspect of his confidence lies in durability. He believed his books would not be exhausted by a single reading. They were written for readers capable of returning repeatedly, discovering new connections each time. In this sense, good means fertile. A good book continues to produce thought long after it is read. It resists being reduced to a summary. It changes the reader's orientation rather than merely conveying information. Nietzsche contrasts this with writing aimed at immediate consumption. Texts designed to persuade quickly or entertain briefly. Such works may be popular, but they lack depth. He did not expect mass readership. He wrote for what he called free spirits, individuals willing to confront unsettling ideas without demanding comfort. Thus, the claim that his books are good is tied to his conception of philosophy itself. Philosophy is not a body of conclusions, but a practice of transformation. A book that leaves the reader unchanged has failed. One of the most unusual aspects of Ecce Homo is that Nietzsche provides commentary on his previous books. He does not summarize them neutrally. He explains what he believes each work accomplished, what problems it addressed, and how it fits into a larger trajectory. In effect, he supplies a map to his philosophy. This is partly defensive. Nietzsche feared that readers would isolate individual concepts, the overman, the will to power, eternal recurrence, and treat them as standalone doctrines. He insists that these ideas are interconnected and must be understood within the context of his entire project. Thus, Spoke Zarathustra, for example, is not merely a poetic work, but the centerpiece of his vision of transformation. Beyond Good and Evil exposes the hidden moral assumptions of philosophy. On the Genealogy of Morals traces the historical origins of those assumptions. Twilight of the Idols tests them directly. Seen together, they form a progression. Nietzsche emphasizes that his philosophy is not primarily destructive. Critique serves preparation. By dismantling inherited values, he creates space for new ones to emerge. Without this clearing, any attempt at creation would simply reproduce the old patterns. He also highlights the emotional tone of each work. Some are confrontational, others exploratory, others celebratory. The variation is intentional. Different problems require different modes of expression. Importantly, he rejects the idea that philosophy should culminate in a system. A fixed system implies closure, but Nietzsche's project is dynamic. It invites continual re-evaluation rather than final answers. His commentary, therefore, functions as guidance rather than dogma. At the same time, it reveals his concern about being misunderstood as merely negative. Because his critiques are often severe, readers may assume he offers nothing constructive. Nietzsche insists that affirmation is central to his thought, even if it appears indirectly. He portrays himself as a physician diagnosing cultural illness. Diagnosis can look destructive because it exposes what is wrong, but the goal is not to destroy the patient, it is to make recovery possible. By interpreting his own works, Nietzsche attempts to ensure that the diagnosis is not mistaken for nihilism. Whether readers accept his interpretation is another question. Once published, a work belongs to its audience as much as to its author. But Ecce Homo is his attempt to shape that reception. Nietzsche presents his isolation not as tragedy, but as necessity. He spent most of his adult life without stable institutional affiliation, without a large circle of intellectual allies, and often without close personal companionship. Illness, geographical movement, and estrangement from former colleagues reinforced this solitude. For many, such isolation would be debilitating. Nietzsche treats it as protective. To develop ideas that fundamentally challenge prevailing values, one must avoid constant exposure to those values. Social environments exert pressure, subtle or overt, to conform. Approval encourages repetition of accepted views. Disapproval discourages deviation. Isolation removes that feedback loop. Without it, a thinker can follow lines of thought to their conclusion without interruption. He can tolerate ambiguity longer, entertain possibilities that would be ridiculed, and resist the temptation to soften claims for the sake of acceptance. Nietzsche does not romanticize loneliness itself. He recognizes its costs: lack of support, limited dialogue, emotional strain. But he distinguishes between involuntary loneliness and chosen solitude. Solitude is structured, it is used. He organizes his days around reading, walking, writing, and reflection. Physical movement plays a central role. Long solitary walks become a form of thinking in motion, allowing ideas to develop rhythmically rather than abstractly. Isolation also shields him from what he perceives as cultural decadence. habits, conversations, and values that would dilute his perspective. By controlling his environment, he preserves intensity. Importantly, this isolation is not contempt for humanity as such. It is distance for the sake of clarity. Nietzsche repeatedly emphasizes that he writes for readers who do not yet exist, future individuals capable of engaging his ideas without hostility or simplification. Isolation thus becomes orientation toward the future rather than withdrawal into bitterness. He also notes that genuine independence is difficult within groups. Even sympathetic communities impose expectations. To belong is to negotiate. To negotiate constantly is to compromise. By remaining outside established movements, Nietzsche maintains the freedom to change his mind, revise his positions, or pursue unconventional directions without accountability to a collective identity. This autonomy is central to his conception of philosophical integrity. Isolation, then, is not merely biographical detail. It is a condition that shaped both the content and the style of his work. Nietzsche's most startling claim in Ecce Homo is not that he is wise or clever, but that he is a destiny. On the surface, this sounds like pure grandiosity, a man declaring himself the turning point of history. It is often cited as evidence of impending madness. But again, Nietzsche's meaning is structural rather than personal. He does not claim to be important because of fame, influence, or institutional power. In his lifetime, he had very little of any of these. What he claims is that his ideas introduce a break, a revaluation that will eventually reshape how values are understood. If Western morality has been built on assumptions that are historically contingent, psychologically motivated, and potentially life-denying, then exposing those foundations has long-term consequences. Once exposed, they cannot be fully restored. Nietzsche sees himself as initiating that exposure. He believes that the collapse of traditional metaphysical and religious certainties is not a temporary crisis, but a transformation of civilization. The phrase "God is dead" does not celebrate atheism, it diagnoses the loss of a unifying framework. In such a situation, new values must eventually emerge. Nietzsche does not claim to supply a finished system to replace the old one. He claims to have opened the problem in a way that future generations will be forced to confront. In this sense, destiny refers to inevitability. If his diagnosis is correct, then his work marks a point of no return. Even those who reject him will be responding to questions he articulated. His influence does not depend on agreement. There is also a temporal dimension. Nietzsche repeatedly states that he writes for readers who do not yet exist. He anticipates misunderstanding in his own era and expects recognition only after cultural conditions change. Thus, destiny is deferred. He presents himself as a precursor, someone whose significance will be recognized retrospectively. This is not a claim to omniscience, but to timing. Importantly, he ties destiny to responsibility. If inherited values collapse, the absence of guidance can lead to nihilism, fanaticism, or regression. The task of creating new values becomes urgent. Nietzsche positions his work as preparation for that task. Whether one accepts this self-assessment or not, the ambition is undeniable. He interprets his philosophy not as contribution to academic debate, but as intervention in the trajectory of Western thought. Reading Ecce Homo with hindsight, it is impossible to ignore that Nietzsche would soon suffer a catastrophic mental collapse from which he never recovered. This proximity creates a dilemma. Should the book be interpreted primarily as a symptom of illness, or as a coherent philosophical text written before the collapse? Many readers default to the first interpretation, reducing its claims to pathology. Nietzsche himself would reject that reduction. He repeatedly insists on clarity, control, and precision. The structure of the book is deliberate. The commentary on his works is consistent with themes developed over decades. The rhetorical exaggerations, while striking, follow patterns present throughout his earlier writing. Nothing in Ecce Homo resembles random incoherence. At the same time, the tone is intensified. Confidence borders on absolutism. Irony becomes harder to distinguish from literal assertion. The emotional temperature is high. It is as if the distance between provocation and proclamation has narrowed. Some scholars argue that the book reflects a mind under extreme strain, not yet disordered, but operating at unsustainable intensity. The same sensitivity that produced insight may also have made stability fragile. Nietzsche himself often described great creativity as risky. To question foundational values without external support requires unusual psychological resilience. Prolonged isolation, chronic illness, and relentless intellectual pressure can erode that resilience. Yet reducing the text to pre-collapse symptoms obscures its content. The ideas remain intelligible. The arguments connect. The self-interpretation, whether accurate or not, follows a discernible logic. Perhaps the most honest reading acknowledges both dimensions, the work of a powerful intellect operating at the edge of its capacity. This tension mirrors Nietzsche's own philosophy. He did not idealize equilibrium. He associated great creation with instability, intensity, and risk. The line between transformation and disintegration is thin. Ecce Homo stands precisely on that line. Because of its tone and context, Ecce Homo is often misread in two opposite ways. One approach dismisses it as madness, a document valuable only for biographical curiosity. The other treats it as sacred self-revelation, accepting Nietzsche's claims at face value. Both approaches flatten the text. To dismiss it as pathology ignores the coherence of its arguments and the continuity with Nietzsche's earlier work. To treat it as unquestionable truth ignores the possibility of exaggeration, irony, or self-mythologizing. Nietzsche himself encourages neither passivity nor reverence. He expects readers to test his claims. Reading Ecce Homo philosophically means asking, what conditions produce a thinker like this? How do health, isolation, temperament, and historical context shape ideas? Which aspects of his self-interpretation illuminate his work, and which may distort it? In other words, the same genealogical method he applies to morality can be applied to him. This reflexivity is part of the book's power. Nietzsche becomes both subject and object of analysis. He exposes his own physiology, habits, and experiences as explanatory factors. He does not claim purity of perspective. He foregrounds its partiality. A careful reading also distinguishes between rhetorical performance and literal assertion. Nietzsche often uses exaggeration to break conventional expectations. What sounds like absolute claim may function as strategic emphasis. Context matters. Moreover, the book invites comparison between Nietzsche's self-portrait and the impression formed from his other writings. Discrepancies are instructive. They reveal tensions between how thinkers see themselves and how their work is received. Rather than resolving these tensions, Ecce Homo intensifies them. To read it well is to resist the desire for a single definitive interpretation. It is to hold multiple possibilities in view: clarity and instability, insight and exaggeration, diagnosis and self-dramatization. This openness aligns with Nietzsche's broader rejection of final answers. By the end of Ecce Homo, what emerges is not a conventional autobiography, but a portrait of a human being who sees himself as an experiment. Nietzsche does not present a story of development from ignorance to enlightenment. He presents a trajectory, a life shaped by necessity, constraint, suffering, and deliberate choice, all converging into a particular philosophical stance. He refuses to separate thinker from thought. His physiology shaped his perception. His isolation shaped his independence. His illness sharpened his discrimination. His historical moment defined his task. Nothing is accidental. Everything is interpreted as part of a coherent pattern. This does not mean that his interpretation is objectively correct. It means that he insists on interpreting his life actively rather than passively. Experience is not merely endured, it is given form. In this sense, Ecce Homo exemplifies one of Nietzsche's central ideas, the possibility of self-creation. To become what one is, a phrase he repeats, does not mean discovering a fixed essence hidden inside. It means shaping one's life into a unified expression of one's drives and capacities. The philosopher becomes artist of himself. Nietzsche's final portrait is therefore neither humble nor apologetic. It is affirmative. He accepts the cost of his path, misunderstanding, solitude, fragility, as inseparable from the insights he believes he achieved. There is no appeal to redemption, no desire to be seen as morally admirable, no attempt to soften his image for posterity. He presents himself as he believes he must be understood, a thinker whose work cannot be detached from the conditions that produced it. Whether one finds this compelling or disturbing, it is difficult to ignore. Ecce Homo closes not with reconciliation, but with exposure. Nietzsche places himself before the reader as both example and challenge, a demonstration of what it looks like when a human life is interpreted through the lens of philosophical intensity.